The presidential transition process is underway within the Trump camp as it prepares to take the reins of the White House come next January. On Press Perspective today, we continue to delve into the diplomatic implications of a second Trump administration for this part of the world. Hello and welcome. It's Friday, November 8th here in South Korea, and you're watching Press Perspective. So what are the diplomatic implications of a second Donald Trump administration for the broader Asia region? To answer this question, I have Kim Xiang, a correspondent for Indonesian English-language broadcaster See Today. Xiang, it's good to have you here in the studio.
Lovely to be here, Sunny.
I also have Christian Datoc, White House correspondent for American news outlet Washington Examiner. Christian, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Great to be back, Sunhee. Thank you.
Right, Christian, let's start off then with the latest on the result of the U.S. election, including that of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Well, Sunhee, Republicans are shaping up to have one of their biggest wins ever in a general election cycle. Of course, Donald Trump will be the next president. The Republicans will take control of the Senate, and it looks like they're on their way to maintaining and even potentially expanding their majority in the House of Representatives. This will certainly make things easier holding all three branches of government for Donald Trump to govern, because he's put down quite a lengthy list of things he wants to accomplish on day one. That being said, just because you have a supermajority doesn't mean it's going to be a walk in the park. You look back to the first Trump term in office, and he was heavily stalled by Republicans, members of his own party, on a number of issues, especially when it came to increasing funding for construction of this so-called border wall along the southern border. Of course, Donald Trump had promised voters that Mexico would pay for that wall. That didn't turn out to be the case. Now, if you take a step back and you look at the actual voting numbers from Tuesday night's election, you'll see that Democrats had a major turnout problem across the board. Vice President Kamala Harris received something like 10 million fewer votes than Joe Biden did in 2020. And if you break down the demographic cells, a number of minority voting groups, Black voters, Latino voters, men in both cases in particular, they swung from being traditionally Democratic voters to backing Donald Trump and feeling this massive wave of Republican dominance that we saw on Tuesday evening.
Right, Christian, before we delve into the analysis behind the result of the latest election, what messages have been shared by the two nominees, Trump and Harris, to their supporters following the result of this latest race?
We heard from Donald Trump late Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning, depending on who you ask. He waited, unlike in the 2020 election, to speak until it became clear that he did have the votes to win a second term in office. But his message was rather un-Trumpian, I think I'd say. He promised unity. He vowed to be a president for all Americans, not just those who supported him. And he congratulated Vice President Harris on running a hard-fought race. He lauded her political instincts and her hard work ethic. It was very different from the way he had described Vice President Harris on the campaign trail. Now, on the other side of the aisle, Harris herself didn't concede the race until later Wednesday afternoon. This had shades of Hillary Clinton not speaking to supporters on election night back in 2016. And she said that while she does concede the race, she won't be conceding the fight that they started earlier this summer. Of course, Democrats have some looking in the mirror to do, because all the rhetoric that they brought up throughout this campaign cycle, be it defense of democracy, extending a helping hand to Americans who've been left behind by both parties, ruling elites for the last 30 to 40 years, that did not resonate. This was an election that was decided on the economy, on immigration, both issues that Donald Trump had a commanding lead, not only over Harris, but over President Joe Biden before he exited the race in July.
Right. Christian, what has been the broader response now, within the U.S., that is, the result of this race?
It's split fairly down partisan lines. I think there is still some navel gazing from Democrats about what they did wrong, but ultimately Republicans are ecstatic. This was the best result they could have hoped for. And if you look at the polls, it wasn't even a certainty that Donald Trump would win this election, let alone Republicans taking back the Senate and maintaining a commanding lead in the House. And I think you have to give the Trump campaign credit, because this was the first presidential election where Donald Trump had not fired a campaign manager. Co-chairs Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles, who will probably both be staffing the White House next year, they did a phenomenal job of keeping what has historically been a rather infighting or partisan group, even within Republicans. They worked to keep them in line. They stopped leaks to the media, and they were able to secure a historic political comeback for Donald Trump.
Right. Xiang, you are a correspondent for Indonesian broadcasters See Today. Now, throughout this week, we've been having a number of foreign press members here in the studio talking about the impact of the U.S. election on Europe, on East Asia, and more. That being said, what can you share with us about the potential impact of a second Trump administration on Southeast Asia, starting first with the economy?
Of course. Now, the second Trump term will have an array of effects on the general economy of Southeast Asia. Now, starting off with some background information, the ASEAN bloc's economy has grown to some $3.6 trillion in 2022, positioning it as the fifth largest economy in the world. Now, all in all, things are not looking too bright for Southeast Asia. The biggest concern in Southeast Asia, which is a shared sentiment across the globe, is Trump's 60% tariff on Chinese imports and 10 to 20% on goods from all other countries. Now, first, in the grand scale of things, the shut-out Chinese goods will now need to find a new market, which are likely to be Southeast Asia, a region that has received around 1/3 of all Chinese investment in the past 20 years, while being home to a growing economy and an abundance of young consumers. Now, the intake of cheap Chinese goods will threaten the development of local industries, as they will find it difficult to compete with Chinese products benefiting from economies of scale and the Chinese state subsidies. Now, Trump's cushion policy of reducing corporate tax rate to 15%, which we'll come back to later, for companies that produce in the US, will also not apply to Southeast Asian countries, as the region's biggest comparative advantage comes from the cheap domestic labor force. Now, secondly, talking about some specific countries, Vietnam, for example, has the most pronounced tariff imposition risks, as they currently run some $90 billion trade surplus with Washington, the third largest contributor to the U.S. trade deficit. Now, the concern here is that due to Vietnam's close relations with China, and this is according to an economist, Vietnam could be a backdoor for Chinese goods into the U.S. markets under the new heavy tariff regime, due to which Vietnam may see some unpredictable policy changes. Now, Thailand is also in a similar situation, where they run a large trade surplus with the U.S., but is increasingly receiving Chinese investments, especially in the electric vehicle sector, which may also alarm the Trump regime. Now, the four strong Southeast Asian economies, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, have recently become partner countries of the Russia-China-led BRICS, which may allow expansion and cooperation with more non-Western countries, balancing Trump America First protective policies. Now, Trump also has threatened to pull the U.S. out of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, and with the ongoing large-scale Chinese investment in the region, Southeast Asia economy will likely to have to navigate finely if they are to benefit from the expected trade conflict.
I see. Xiang, what about in terms of diplomacy and defense? How does a second Trump administration look to affect Southeast Asia on those fronts?
Yeah, I mean, as traditionally, Southeast Asia is a region where many countries see themselves as less dependent on the US compared to Europe and countries like Australia, Korea, and Japan. And as I mentioned before, more countries partnering up with anti-Western blocs such as BRICS is a proof that many want to benefit from both sides by carefully sitting on the fence. Now, nonetheless, the region does not operate under a united political agenda, where countries like the Philippines is acting as a loyal ally to the US, with its President Marcos Jr. even mentioning his personal encounter with Trump as a young man in his congratulatory statement. Now, Manila and Beijing saw an increase in tensions in the South China Sea, for which it's clear the Philippines are hoping for continued U.S. support. However, as we've experienced previously, Trump is likely to weaken a multilateral approach and destabilize key regions unless it will visibly benefit the U.S. So Muslim-majority countries like Malaysia will likely have to be careful in expressively supporting Palestine, while Indonesia, which held its first ever joint military training drills with Russia earlier this week, as well as its entry into BRICS, may perhaps look to keep a balance between the world's superpowers. Now, Indonesia's newly inaugurated President Prabowo Subianto has also chosen China as his first overseas trip, with his arrival scheduled actually for today, after which he is expected to fly to the US.
Right then, Christian, regarding defense, and based on what Mr. Trump has said thus far, what are your thoughts regarding the fate of US service members stationed here in South Korea?
Well, Soon-hee, I don't expect any U.S. troops stationed in South Korea to actually be recalled to the United States, but obviously this is a question because of the way Donald Trump has thrown a wrench into U.S. relationships with allies across the globe. We saw it during his first term in office. He pressed the NATO bloc countries to seriously increase their defense spending, and he is doing the same thing when it comes to his statements about North Korea. He has demanded that South Korea. He has demanded South Korea pay upwards of $10 billion a year to house U.S. troops. That's a significant increase to what South Korea currently pays. But ultimately, President-elect Trump, is focused purely on decreasing Chinese influence, not only in the region, but across the globe. He's talked about it on the campaign trail. He believes China is the sleeping dragon, as he's put it, the greatest threat to U.S. dominance on the global stage. And I don't think he would ostracize a key ally like South Korea, considering that's the bulk of the U.S. troops on the Asian continent. There are currently somewhere between 28 to 29,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. They would be critical if a wider regional war were to break out, God forbid it. But again, this is classic Donald Trump. He is happy to walk into any room and blow up the current status quo, including, as it stands, with U.S. allies. I expect him to continue to squeeze not only South Korea, but all U.S. allies across the globe, because he has talked about resetting the fundamental discussion about how China needs to be countered, not only militarily, but economically. I would expect more of this rhetoric from the Trump team, but I wouldn't expect U.S. troops to leave the Korean Peninsula.
Right. Back on the economy then, Xiong, as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Trump has vowed a tariff on all imports into the U.S. How does this reality look to affect South Korea's exports to the U.S.? Yeah,
now that's a tricky question, and Christian mentioned a good point. The relation with China as well is quite important that works here. So initially, obviously the across-the-board tariff of 10 to 20% is the grave concern for the export-led Korean economy. However, Trump's corporate tax cut, which I mentioned earlier, of 15% for companies that produce domestically, may act as an advantage for the leading companies in Korea, some of which have already been forced to start branching out its manufacturing facilities to the U.S. during the previous Trump administration. Now, that includes the likes of Samsung Electronics, Hyundai Motors electric car plant, LG Energy Solution, and SK On's battery plants, which are already being built and preparing for operation in the U.S. Specific sectors where Korea has standout advantage, such as the shipbuilding industry, has already been mentioned by Trump on his phone call to Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, where he suggested an increase in cooperation. Now, this may be intended to keep the Chinese shipbuilders in check, as Christian mentioned, the competition with China, but will obviously work as a benefit for Korea. Trump's policy to increase military contributions from its allies can also benefit the Korean defense industry, as more countries are likely to look for high-tech but cheaper and conflict-free weapons from global arms industry leaders such as Korea.
Right. Aside from tariffs then, Christian, I understand that this may be a bit too early to tell, but what do you suppose would be on Mr. Trump's to-do list with regard to foreign policy apart from tariffs?
Well, apart from tariffs, I think the loudest note we've heard from Donald Trump on resetting at least foreign policy as it stands under the Biden administration is altering our commitments to Ukraine. Obviously, the United States has been the biggest backer of Ukraine's fight to defend its sovereignty against Russia over the past 3 years. And while Donald Trump doesn't necessarily say Russia should be able to continue this invasion, he has proposed brokering a peace deal personally between Presidents Zelensky and Putin. He doesn't want to just continue to keep sending blank checks, as he calls it, to the Ukrainian military. Now, Joe Biden himself has said he wants to get another round of roughly $70 billion dispersed to Ukraine before leaving office. And I would expect Donald Trump to try and stall that if Joe Biden is able to get a new round of funding on the books, again, before January. Beyond foreign policy, I mean, Donald Trump does have a lengthy checklist of items he says he wants to accomplish on day one, but virtually all of them, will take significantly more time to complete. He's talked about initiating mass deportations of migrants coming out from South and Central America. He's talked about gutting the departments of education and the environment to government agencies that Republicans consistently want to draw down funding for. He has also talked about firing Jack Smith, who is the special prosecutor overseeing the cases against Trump's actions on January 6th. And again, if you just think about what Trump has talked about in the past, from a fundamental standpoint, he wants to reset how the federal government operates. That includes firing hundreds, if not thousands, of staffers, not only in Washington, D.C., but at local branches across the country. I think Donald Trump in his first term was sort of constrained by what is traditionally viewed as the Republican establishment. That being said, during his second term in office, he's going to have officials who are supremely loyal to him and willing to enact these policies as soon as possible. I just don't think the bulk of them will be able to be accomplished on his first day in office.
Right, of course not. In the meantime, Xiong here, how are analysts in this part of the world responding to the result of the 2024 US presidential race?
Yeah, I mean, initially, I think a lot of the Korean analysts and the broadcasters here were focusing on the effect of Trump's re-election rather than how he won the election. So, I mean, US dollar to Korean won exchange rate skyrocketed, going over 1,400 won for a dollar, while Korea Institute for International Economic Policy said $44.8 billion in exports may vaporize for Korea if Trump administration imposes a 20% import tariff. Now, from what I see as a journalist, there definitely was a gentle pro-Harris sentiment, or at least fears over Trump's victory among analysts and broadcasters here in Korea, as well as some parts of the world, for the simple reason to avoid unpredictability in the current turbulent global geopolitical climate with the ongoing wars and all that. But in the end, everybody failed to see the reality of American life, where many in the poorer states suffer daily and can be easily radicalized. That change was needed, and albeit Trump may not have been the voters' ideal candidate, he was the only alternative to break out of the current Democratic administration.
Right. Christian, this is an impromptu question, but how are pundits there in Washington, D.C. explaining perhaps this turnout?
Sunny, I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, but I think the biggest takeaway right now is that there was this huge swing of minority voters, Black and Latino voters, away from the Democratic Party. And what the pundits can't quite seem to agree on is why exactly this happened. One camp seems to believe that the Democrats' messaging, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris's messaging on the economy did not hit home with this group of people. There's another group that believes social issues, be they the abortion debate, be it a topic which has received a lot of press coverage here in the United States, transgender athletes competing in women's sports. The second camp believes that the Democratic Party, as it were, has gone too woke. They have pushed these social issues and alienated what has traditionally been a core group of their electorate, even if they vote slightly more conservative on those fiscal issues. than progressive, white, educated, college-educated voters do. And again, there's a lot of navel-gazing, but there are so many similarities to the 2016 election, where former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was widely expected to win, and it just doesn't look like those lessons hit home. Again, Donald Trump overperformed in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. They have huge low or a blue-collar working class populations, and traditionally these union workers have backed Democrats. But starting in 2016 and culminating in the 2024 general election on Tuesday night, that group has virtually entirely switched its party affiliations, at least at the presidential level. What is interesting is that some Democratic congressional candidates, be they in the Senate or in the House, they actually overperformed Vice President Harris with these groups. And it's one of the reasons why Democrats still have a fighting chance of potentially holding on to a majority in the House and not losing all three chambers along Pennsylvania Avenue.
Right, because the Senate right now is run by the Republicans, well, starting next year, that is. All right, Christian, thank you so much for taking my impromptu question as well and for your insights today.
No problem. Thanks for having me back.
Right, and Xiang here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you, Sunny.
Right, well, that is all the time we have today. Have a great weekend. See you same time next Monday.